In 1888, 5 women were murdered in London's East End. The killer was never caught. But that's not why we still talk about this. Something else happened. A name appeared in print. Jack the Ripper. And once that name appeared, something changed. Not just about this case, but about murder itself. London, 1888. The richest city on earth, the beating heart of the British Empire, a superpower that spans the globe. And yet, only a few streets away from grand boulevards and shiny theaters, another world exists. A world of overcrowded slums, of hunger, of cheap gin, of people sleeping on actual ropes. And it's here, in this neglected part of London, that the name is born. A name that would outlive the empire itself. Jack the Ripper. To understand Jack the Ripper, we have to step back, far enough to see that he didn't emerge from fog and darkness like a gothic villain. He came from a system of poverty and industrial speed, and of something new, mass attention. 1888, the 51st year of Queen Victoria's reign. The British Empire spans the globe. The future seems to arrive all at once. And for the first time, millions could read the same news at the same time. But London isn't just a shiny, booming metropolis. Just minutes away from Victorian wealth lies Whitechapel. It's not the kind of place where people chose to live. It's where you end up when everything else fails. Around 80,000 people were packed into these notorious districts of the East End. Irish immigrants, Jewish refugees fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe, dock workers, beggars, alcoholics, entire families squeezed into rooms. Work was scarce, and for many women, survival left only one option: prostitution. Whitechapel was already primed to explode. And in the autumn of 1888, the Ripper ignited it. 3:40 a.m., Friday, August 31st. A carman makes an unnerving discovery in Bucks Row. A woman named Ann Nichols is found lying in the street. Her throat is cut so deeply that it nearly decapitates her. Her abdomen has been cut open. Even though crime is common in that part of London, this attack feels different, more focused, less like a drunken fight, and more like a deliberate procedure. At first, newspapers treated it just like another Whitechapel murder. However, something had begun. Within weeks, more bodies appeared in the East End. Then came Annie Chapman. Her body was discovered on September 8. Her throat severed in the same manner. But this time, it went further. Her uterus was missing. This wasn't random anymore. There was a pattern. Some thought it required medical skill, something your average gin-drunk robber doesn't have. Others disagreed. Police and newspapers linked the two murders, and the panic started to grow. Papers were already going crazy, but then they went wild. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Central News Agency, and its author claimed to be the murderer. Today, we call this the Dear Boss letter, and this is where everything shifts. The killer stopped being only a suspect and became a character. A killer without a face had been given a brand. London citizens demanded swift action. The same month, volunteers formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, headed by George Lusk. They acted because the police had failed to arrest the Ripper, and because the murders were affecting their businesses. By late September, London was frantic. Private investigators were booked busy for months. People were afraid to walk the Pugley streets after dark. And then, he struck again. Not one victim, but two. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both killed in the early hours of September 30th, only 45 minutes apart. One murder interrupted, the other mutilated with brutal precision. By morning, London knew something terrifying. This wasn't random violence, it was deliberate, and it was getting worse. Near 3 a.m., Catherine Eddowes' apron was discovered by a lone police constable. A chalk-written sentence on the wall marked the spot. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. I know what we all think. Did the Ripper write this, or was it already there when the apron was dumped? Hard to say, as anti-Semitic graffiti was common in Whitechapel. The district was already struggling and suspicious of outsiders. Anti-Semitism was already there. Whether the Ripper wrote this on the wall or not, the tension was real. Fearing possible anti-Semitic riots, the police commissioner ordered the graffiti to be washed from the wall. By sunrise, the words were gone. But the suspicion remained. In a city in fear, rumor was stronger than chalk. But then it gets worse. On October 16, George Lusk, head of the Vigilance Committee we met earlier, received a strange letter. The writer claimed to be the Ripper. The handwriting was different from the earlier Dear Boss letter, but what was inside was far more chilling. Half a human kidney. Newspapers printed the whole thing, and crowds started gathering outside police stations waiting for any kind of update. And every new rumor made it grow. 2 weeks later, the worst attack was discovered. On November 9, a landlord and his assistant go over to Mary, known by her street names Dark or Black Mary, to collect the rent. They peer through the window, and what they see is enough to send even Boyer, a hardened ex-soldier, fleeing the scene. He doesn't stop running until he reaches the police station. He said, "Another one. Jack the Ripper. It's awful. McCarthy sent me." Looking at the crime scene, it's not hard to understand why he reacted like this. Mary Jane Kelly was found on her bed in a single room. This was the most extreme of the canonical 5. The Ripper had performed it without fear of discovery in a locked room. Her injuries were so severe that the autopsy took hours. What was done to her body went beyond what most newspapers were willing to print, and even now, reading the details feels less like historical research. It feels like crossing a line. So I'm not going to go any further, because at some point, talking about the violence stops being analysis, and it starts turning into spectacle. However, if you are thinking of checking the pictures, I warn you, some of her organs were found on the bedside table. And that's all you need to know. So we get 5 women brutally murdered in just over 2 months. 5 women lost their lives, but the world remembered only the killer's name. And that name spread everywhere. And by the end of the year, London believed something terrifying. The killer might never be caught. But the story was only getting bigger. And this is where the story stops being about murder and starts being about media. But the real shift wasn't the murders, it was how people experienced them. In the Victorian era, millions of people could read the news every day. Sensationalist papers were cheap, about the price of 10 minutes of a laborer's wage. And newspapers learned something dangerous: fear sells. And once they learned that, they didn't stop. At the height of the investigation, the Whitechapel murders dominated public attention. You see, Whitechapel was already seen as a place of crime, poverty, and outsiders. And the Ripper seemed to confirm every fear London already had about the East End, about the darkness lurking beneath modern society. Jack the Ripper became the first modern media villain. Not the first serial killer, but the first to enter public imagination. The Metropolitan Police were not only searching for a killer, they were trying to alter a rumor machine. Because, yes, fake news existed even then, and they even led to arrests. Just days after the murder of Ann Nichols, the first victim, newspapers were already reporting that the police were keeping details secret. At the same time, attention was starting to focus on a local figure known as Letter Apron, a name already spreading through the East End. Frustrated by the lack of official information, journalists began to speculate. Basically, spread bullshit. A local Jewish bootmaker, John Pizer, was soon linked to the nickname and arrested, even though the police privately admitted there was no evidence connecting him to the murders. He was later released after his alibis were confirmed. With the publication of the Dear Boss letter, the name Jack the Ripper replaced Letter Apron in newspapers and in gossip. Short, violent, memorable, it fit perfectly into a headline. And the name wasn't entirely new. London folklore already had a similar figure, Spring Hill Jack. A mysterious attacker said to leap over walls, strike without warning, and vanish into the night. Decades later, a journalist would actually claim responsibility for the letters, saying he wrote them to keep the business alive. Good old 19th century fake news. But one major question still remains. Were all 5 murders committed by the same killer? Well, no one knows for sure. In total, 11 murders were included in the official Whitechapel murders investigation. But even today, we are not sure how many were actually his. In the following years, almost every brutal murder in Whitechapel was assumed to be the work of Jack. A female torso found, for example. Because by then, the Ripper was everywhere. Copying him required no imagination. The last of the 11 murders happened years after the first one. The public wanted closure, and the press, of course. For a short time, both the police and the papers had a suspect. A stalker was charged with the murder, even though he had alibis and didn't fit the profile of a precise serial killer. He was released for lack of evidence and even received compensation from the same press that publicly branded him the Ripper. The Whitechapel murders became a legend, a story that would continue shaping how society remembers serial violence. So if we cannot even say who he was, or whether he was one man at all, why does this case refuse to die? The Ripper was the first modern serial killer, the first to receive letters, the first to become a name, short, violent, catchy. And the habit stuck. Killers began to receive names. From Jack the Ripper to the Zodiac Killer, the pattern repeated itself. A name turns a person into a character, one that travels farther than a simple police file. But a name does something else, something much more dangerous. It can stylize. For example, the Night Stalker sounds almost mythic, more like a comic book anti-hero than a man responsible for real deaths. The Whitechapel murders didn't just produce fear. They changed how violence could exist in public imagination. It could be packaged, named, serialized, retold. In the century that followed, fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter or Dexter Morgan will be written not only as monsters, but as intelligent, watchable, even charismatic figures. The shift didn't start in a TV studio. It began in 1888 when a Victorian murderer was turned into a headline identity. Because what made Jack the Ripper immortal wasn't his knife, it was attention, non-stop coverage. Fear turned into entertainment. People followed the case like a Netflix series. Will he strike again? Is he a doctor? A foreigner? The police became characters. The letters became plot twists. The killer became a brand. And once that happens, the truth becomes secondary. What matters is the story, and in a strange way, we are still part of that story. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer, he was the first modern murder myth. Not a man, a mirror.